Government spending has a significant impact on the country's economic growth. Budget allocation in the yearly money provided include plans to guarantee that the assigned budget may boost Malaysian growth and development while also being enjoyed by all Malaysians. Therefore, it is essential to study the effect of several types of government spending on economic growth to help in wisely budget allocation.
Next is research objective. There are three objectives that we provide for this research. First is to determine the relationship between the education expenditure and economic growth of Malaysia. Second is to determine the relationship between the general administration expenditure and economic growth of Malaysia. And the third is to determine the relationship between the military expenditure and economic growth of Malaysia. Next, I will explain about the ordinary least square or OLS. Based on the result, it shows that almost all the variables which are education and military expenditure are shown to be insignificant except for the independent variable of general administration. Education and military expenditure has an insignificant p-value because it's more than 0.10. The value of R-square is 0.5134, which means that the model is quite strong and the observed variation or variable can be explained by the model. So the results show that every 1% increase in education of the government expenditure show that economic growth will decrease by 2.9416. Next, every 1% increase in general administration of the government expenditure show economic growth will increase by 3.0672. And last is every 1% increase in military expenditure show that the economic growth will decrease by 4.1243.
Autocorrelation has been tested to find the correlation in variable between a time given and a lag version of it over successive time intervals. Here it is tested by using Durbin-Watson test. The null hypothesis is there is autocorrelation problem, and hypothesis 1 there is no autocorrelation problem. Durbin-Watson value is 0.03475. By using the Durbin-Watson table, D lower is 0.6 and Durbin upper is 1.93. Here, Durbin-Watson is below Durbin lower and we can reject null hypothesis and there is no autocorrelation problem. Figures show the pattern of residuals. The trend shows there is negative autocorrelation.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Khirol Nazrin bin Basri. For my first slide presentation, I'm gonna talk about multiclonarity test. Multiclonarity test is a statistical phenomenon characterized by the presence of two or more strongly interrelated independent variables in regression model. In this instance, the coefficient estimates may fluctuate unpredictable in response to minor change in the model or data. Multiclonarity may provide an erroneous result for any single independent variable, resulting in an invalid explanation. The independent variable should not have a linear connection. So, according to the result of correlation test that we made using Excel, there is some correlation between each variables with an excess of 0.7, that indicating strong interdependence between explanatory variables. As a result, there appears to be a problem with multiclonarity. So that's all for multicollinearity test.
Next, I will present about heteroskedasticity. Heteroskedasticity is a problem where it has unequal spread problem in the model. If the model has heteroskedasticity, it will make the OLS estimation becomes inefficient and the hypothesis is no longer reliable. In order to detect heteroskedasticity in this model, we use the part LM test. From the part LM test that has been done with HO is homoskedasticity and H1 is heteroskedasticity, we found out that this model has no heteroskedasticity as the probability of chi-square is bigger than the observation times R square. Thus, it failed to reject the null hypothesis HO. Next, we move on to the finding result discussion. Finding at 5% level significant result for all independent variables, that is education expenditure, general administration expenditure, and military expenditure failed to reject null hypothesis. Thus, there is no relationship between these three independent variables and economic growth of Malaysia. As for 10% significant level, variables that has p-value lower than 0.1 is significant. On the other hand, variables that has p-value higher than 0.1 is insignificant. In summary, only general and administration expenditure is significant, which it has a relationship with the economic growth of Malaysia. As general and administration expenditure p-value is 0.09, which is lower than 0.1, which makes it reject the null hypothesis. Meanwhile, education expenditure p-value is 0.29 and military expenditure p-value is 0.32, which makes them fail to reject the null hypothesis, thus insignificant. Therefore, it shows that education expenditure and military expenditure has no relationship with the economic growth of Malaysia.
This time I'm gonna talk about the implication of our research. According to the research, education has substantial association with economic growth. However, military and general administrative have no significant relationship with economic growth. As a result, we propose that the government refrain from increasing budget allocation for military and general administrative purpose. Different sort of government expenditure will have verifying effect on economic growth. As a result, it has a larger potential to increase government expenditure efficiency through reallocation among sector. Thus, we made policy proposal. First, public money should be effectively channeled to productive activity that have a substantial impact on economic growth, such as education. Other than that, collaboration between the government and the private sector required to provide key infrastructure services that will aid in economic growth and development. To avoid a crowding out impact on government investment, government consumer expenditure should be properly coordinated across all branches of government. Similarly, there should be high level of openness and accountability in government spending in many areas of economy to prevent public monies from being channeled into private account of government official and staff. And then, to avoid overestimation of project implementation costs, the government should constantly oversee the contract awarding process for process for capital projects. This will have a big influence on economic growth through public investment spending. Capital recurring economic service expenditure should be allocated primarily toward productive economic activity. This will promote economic activity and maybe counterattack the negative influence on economic growth. The share of total government expenditure allocated to capital and recurrent expenditure finance should be raised since these components have a large beneficial impact on the economy. Because the research revealed that education spending had more beneficial impact than general administrative and mineral spending. It deserves more favorable consideration in the distribution of government funds. The presence of a link between government spending and economic development justify Malaysia's continuous employment of fiscal policy instruments to attain macroeconomic goals. That's all for implication of our research. The limitation of our research. There were few limitations to the research in this study. This research demonstrates that the general administration and military have a negligible link with economic growth, although there are very little literature to back up the claim. Without backing of literature, the analysis findings are insufficient to explain the rise and lack of credibility. The difficulties of multicollinearity could not be handled in this study. Because of the presence of multicollinearity, the data may be difficult to access. This issue will also result in the acceptance of the null hypothesis, indicating the presence of multicollinearity. That's all for our limitation in our research.
There is a few recommendations for future research. The first one is to add more numbers of observation, as we only use 10 years of observation with yearly data. Therefore, future researchers can use quarterly data or use longer time period to solve the multicollinearity problem in the model. Besides that, future researchers may use different types of tests or do double testing for each of the problems, such as autocorrelation, multicollinearity, and heteroscedasticity that might occur in the model to ensure the credibility of the model.
In conclusion, the objective of this research were achieved in terms of determining the relationship between government expenditure on economic growth. The impact of these three independent variables, which are education, general administration, and military expenditure, have been figured out in hence in affecting economic growth. Aside from that, based on the limitation endured during this research, a recommendation for further research has been made. And finally, this study can be used as a guideline for future researchers to conduct their own research.